Well now, it's Thursday, I have the house to myself for an hour, and so it's time for another episode of the Gerard Brennan Disorder podcast. This is the theme music. So last time we spoke, I did a reading of an Edgar Allan Poe story called The Telltale Heart, and today I'm going to continue the short story theme. After The Telltale Heart, I read a very, very short story called Bloodbath, which was featured in my short story collection, Possession, Obsession and a Diesel Compression Engine, which is a very short and snappy title, I think you would agree. The title's nearly longer than the actual story or book itself, in that there's only 6 stories in it, and they're all quite short. These stories are set in the Fireproof universe, and I'm not sure I entirely explained what that meant last time I mentioned it. Excuse me. I think I'm getting sick. Today I haven't done much more than wake up, get some breakfast, then develop a headache and go back to bed for a nap. So I do think I might be coming down with something. I have no idea what. I think it might be an ear infection or something like that. So feel sorry for me, please. Anyway, getting back to the point, I was saying that these stories are set in the Fireproof universe, and what that means is that these all occurred in the same universe that I conceive the Fireproof novel to be part of. Now, I've written a follow-up to Fireproof, but I'm not sure I'm very happy with it yet. I haven't really tackled it since I'm still procrastinating on a essay about Steve Kavanagh's work. Speaking of which, thank you to Steve Kavanagh, because I'm using a copy of the 13 to prop up my lamp stroke microphone stand. It's also on top of a Fern Cotton How to Be Happy book, which is an interesting combination. As you can see, there's a bit of a reading divide in our house, although my wife does like a lot of crime fiction as well. She's read most of the books that I have, and she reads faster than me, which is something I envy. Anyway, back to Possession, Obsession and a Diesel Compression Engine. Today's story is titled Steele Guitar. Now I'm running into this one kind of blind. I haven't done a read through on it, so hopefully there are no sentences that I'm going to stumble through or anything like that. Honestly, I just don't have time to do my usual couple of practice reads and then do this, because Michelle has taken the kids out for a very short time, and I'm conscious that I'll need to make the best of it. So, without further babble, please listen to Steele Guitar by Gerard Brennan. Jessica Steele hunkered down and flicked off the electric rotary fan that powered the ancient Hook and Hastings Opus church organ. Behind the pipes, self-conscious and hiding, even in an empty church, she stood and stretched, arms raised straight into the air and slender hands rotating on supple wrists. She tilted her head back, pushed her hips forward, and her stiffened spine popped. Bliss. Her thick blonde plait swayed like a church bell rope in a drafty steeple as she held the stretch. She tried to ignore the feel of her breasts straining against her sweater, trapped in an inadequate B-cup. The small bras would have to do until her father approved her request to work a part-time job. She didn't want to embarrass either of them by asking for underwear money. Her father, Reverend Steele, had appointed her organist a little over a year ago on her 17th birthday. Aware of the idea of nepotism, she took her role very seriously. She practised every night for hours, perfecting each hymn. The minister could not be reproached by cantankerous congregates if she didn't fail him. Though for all of her obsessive practice, Jessica suspected that the adoring flock would not have bitten their collective tongue even if she'd a handful of thumbs. Who could blame a widowed and heartbroken minister for keeping his only child close and safe? Still, it was no excuse for sloppiness. Her mobile phone, or the minister line as she'd once referred to it in a rare rebellious thought, vibrated in the hip pocket of her bootcut jeans. She thumbed the green button. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, Jessie. Dinner's almost ready." "Jessica will be with you shortly." The minister chuckled. "Okay, Jessica. Come on home." "I was just leaving." "Don't forget to turn off the rotary fan." "I already have, and I'll turn off the lights and set the alarm on my way out." "Okay, honey." You'll find your dinner in the oven. I'm going to nip out to Tesco and get the shopping in. Have you got a key? Yes, Daddy. See you later. Bye. She sped through the security routine and hit the street. University Road, the aorta from Queen's University campus into Belfast. Fighting against the flow of student cells with a mission to bring life to the city centre nightclubs, Jessica looked forward to dinner, hot chocolate, a light read and bed. She wanted to tackle the next day full of beans. Her first university lecture at the School of Music and Sonic Arts. Ahead, she fixed her eyes on the trees lining the campus grounds. The back-to-school weather kept the nights bright and the leaves still held on to their branches, green and vibrant. With each step, the trees bobbed like Granny Smith apples at a Halloween party. She looked forward to the autumn. She liked those trees to shed their green. The brown munchy leaves took the bad look off the crusted Red Bull tins and cigarette butts lining the gutter, and the cushioned Converse-clad footsteps on their way to the church. Lost in an innocent desire for autumn, she almost walked into the side of a silver Ford Focus, idling on double yellow lines at the corner of University Square Junction. A man, grinning with huge slabs of snow-white enamel, stood on the driver's side with his elbows resting on the roof. He wore a fedora, and although he was far too young for it, he carried it off. Hi, Jessica. Jessica took a step back and hugged a manila folder containing her sheet music. How do you know my name? The huge grin widened to cartoon crocodile proportions. He nodded to her breasts. You've got very pretty handwriting, he said. Jessica felt the instant flush of embarrassment. He'd read her name off the music folder's flap. She'd penned it there with her calligraphy set last month. The stranger stared on. Can I help you, sir? What makes you think I need help? Don't you? Well, yes, it so happens I do. Lucky for you. Jessica shook her head. Look, I have to get home. I hope you... But still didn't know what he needed help with. Get this stupid car door open? Me too. Oh, you locked yourself out? No, the car locked me out. Says I've got a lead foot. Stupid machine. Jessica wasn't sure, but she thought the engine's rumble might have climbed a few notes, as if warning the man in the sharp suit and fedora. She looked at the silver Focus again. It had an air of menace about it, squat and ready to pounce from its 5-spoke alloy haunches. Anyway, he said, I'm a little strapped for cash and I need a phone to organise a new set of wheels. Can you help me? I would like to, but I don't have any cash on me. You have a phone, though? Yes, but... Well then, sell me your phone. I'll make my calls and sell it on after. But Daddy will... Never need to know you sold on your phone. Tell him you lost it. But I don't lie. You will when you see what I have to offer. Jessica had no idea how to handle the bargaining man. She looked at him blankly. At last, the butts stop. Now look at this. He bent at the waist and retrieved a black canvas guitar case, a gig bag, from somewhere down by his feet. He carried it by the hand grip and scuttled around the car, eyeing its headlights with mistrust. You've got musician's hands, he said. I'll give you what's in this gig bag for your phone. Deal of a lifetime. I'm screwing myself. Jessica's cheeks reddened. Apologies for the vulgarity, he said, but I am getting very little for this wonderful instrument. You should be snapping my arms off. I'm not a guitarist. I'm an organist. You could be both. Look, take the phone, okay? She held the phone out to him at arm's length. I just want to go home. He shook his head. Sorry, we don't work that way. You have to trade with me and everything else I have is inside this vindictive vehicle. Please take the guitar, okay? I don't even know for sure that there is a guitar in there. It could be drugs or guns for all I know. He took a step closer and pushed back the brim of his fedora with an index finger. The strip of shadow across his eyes shifted to reveal violet irises. They flashed in the September sunset. Are you calling me a drug dealer? I'm sorry, but... Do you know how lucky you are, Jessica? You're being offered a guitar at the crossroads. Doesn't that strike you as somewhat symbolic? Don't you think there might be greater forces at play here? And all I'm asking you for is your phone. I mean, some people would give up their souls for this. Now just take the guitar and give me that phone, okay? Camden Street isn't really in line with University Street. I don't think you can call this a crossroad. This is just a junction. Look, it's the best I could do in this haphazard road system. There was a better one in the city, but the NCP parking attendants were all over it. Now, if you just take the bloody instrument, we can go our separate ways. Please don't lose your temper. I'm not losing my temper. You're raising your voice. I am not. Give me the... Stop shouting at me. Give me the phone! Jessica shocked herself by throwing the phone at him, hard. At that range it should have bounced off his head, but he flinched and caught it in his free hand. She blinked, surprised by her loss of self-control and her antagonist's reflexes. He held the guitar out to her, smiling again. Pleasure doing business with you. He winked at her as she took it from him. She watched the salesman hurry down University Street, tapping at the buttons of her phone. Beside her, the Ford's engine suddenly cut out as an NCP parking attendant rounded the corner. She felt strange, light-headed but calm. The gig bag weighed less than she expected. Maybe it would be nice to have such a portable instrument, something to play at home. Home. If she got moving now, she'd still beat father back to their house on Fitzwilliam Street. Jessica whistled softly through her teeth when she flipped back the unzipped flap of the gig bag. On top of her pink quilted bed lay a Jackson Flying V with a Floyd Rose tremolo system. The guitar's black, lacquered body boasted a customised blue lightning effect paint job, forking out from the twin double-coil humbucker pickups. The frets bored ivory shark fin inlays understated the reversed headstock. Jessica had never seen anything as beautiful. Ever. She imagined herself cranking out killer riffs, skipping across the stage like Angus Young, or smoking a Sly signature in Marlboro Red, with her blonde hair hanging in her eyes. Oh yeah, she'd seen the MTV music videos. And she'd seen the kind of teenagers who listened to that music, goths and punks, loitering around City Hall and dishing out dirty looks to pensioners. The thought of playing a Sunday service hymn on her organ to an audience of angry teens cloaked in black gave her a little smile. Then she flipped the image to one of her on stage with the Jackson, wagging her tongue at a following of loyal Methodist pensioners, trailing her first world tour. She clucked and shook her head. Ridiculous, of course. Even though music was for everyone, a happy medium didn't really exist in the metal scene. It went against everything. It went against the spirit of the genre. She twiddled the volume knob on the guitar, disappointed but not knowing why when nothing happened. Heavy metal. She owned a heavy metal guitar. And if her father found out about it, he'd freak out. He believed heavy metal to be the work of the devil. In the 80s, he'd spearheaded a campaign examining subliminal messages in music. Children at the local school were presented with the results. Popular bands like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest and Bros were linked to Satanism when their records were played backwards. Now he could never be convinced that any metal ensemble didn't have an ulterior motive. He couldn't even consider the new Christian metal bands emerging on the music scene. Jessica didn't have the heart to share her opinion on the matter. But really, devil's music? Didn't her father understand that it was all tongue-in-cheek? Tentative, she reached for the guitar and scooped it down from its canvas case, like a child from its crib. The guitar had been lying on a glossy little paperback. She'd laid the Jackson across her lap and reached for the book. Screaming Riffs for Talented Beginners. She quickly thumbed through a few of the pages and saw it was filled with short melodies, the kind you played loud and proud. She plucked each string from the fattest to the thinnest and figured out their notes by ear. E, A, D, G, B, E. Even without an amp, the crisp strings sounded great. She quickly figured out a simple chord, C minor. She strummed. It rang out, morose but spine-tingling. She grabbed Screaming Riffs for Talented Beginners and opened to page 1. She read the first riff and committed it to memory, then stood up, slung the guitar across her shoulders and stood in front of the mirror of her white wardrobe door. The flying V hung low, just below her waist. She snarled at her reflection. Looking good, she thought. The guitar's neck nestled in her hand, made to measure. She attempted the first riff. Not perfect, a little too much fret buzz, but she had time, and she had desire. And she felt damned good behind an instrument that fit her frame. That night she curled up in bed with her left hand on the pillow next to her face. With each breath, The pound-coin smell of the strings on her tender fingertips swirled in her nostrils. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of her first heavy metal gig. By the time Sunday service came round, Jessica had learned every piece of music in the little book. But as usual, she sat at the old organ, clean and crisp in her Sunday dress, while her father welcomed the congregation. Unlike any other day, Jessica had to fight to keep herself from fidgeting. She felt sick with excitement. When her father finished with the pleasantries, he nodded to his daughter, as he did every Sunday. Jessica's hands fell to the huge ivory keyboard. Her fingers formed the opening chord and pushed downwards. Nothing. She feigned a theatrical expression of confusion and pushed down on the keys again. Still there was no sound. After a third attempt, the congregation began to shift in the pews. "Please excuse me," said Jessica as she got up from her stool and disappeared behind the giant instrument. She didn't turn on the motor-driven rotary fan needed to create the sound in the huge room. Jessica stepped out from behind the pipes and shrugged at her father. The minister looked at his congregation and smiled. His patient expression settled them somewhat and the shuffling ceased. Jessica vanished behind the pipes again. She carried out the little 60-watt Marshall lamp she'd borrowed from the School of Music and set it in front of her minister's feet. She smiled at Reverend Steele and scampered behind the pipes to retrieve the flying V. She plugged the jack lead into the amp. A hair-raising crackle and hiss shattered the uncomfortable silence. Time to make her own dreams come true. "Plan B, Daddy." Her father's brow furrowed. She winked at him, knowing he wouldn't cause a scene in the church. She felt bad for springing her performance on him, but he'd never have agreed to it in a month of Sundays. Before turning to her captive audience, Jessica pinwheeled her right arm, and her hand crashed down on the strings. An overdrive distorted power chord filled the small church. Somebody yelped in surprise. Jessica giggled. She turned on her heel and played one of the pieces from Screaming Riffs for Talented Beginners, the one called Pay the Man. The acoustics in the church gave the little amp a helping hand. Wall-to-wall metal. In a flurry of hammer-ons, pull-offs and pinch harmonics, Jessica added a little improvised lick. She got lost in the performance until the first screams. She looked up as 15 people seated in the front leapt out of their pews in a jerky and violent commotion. As Jessica's music reached its crescendo, the 15 screamed again, in key with Jessica's guitar. The effect stunned her, but her fingers continued to dance on the strings. Her brain fought for a halt, but her hands defied it. Her heart straddled the line in the dirt. She wanted the music. She needed the music. But those screaming, dancing people freaked her out. She whipped her arms away from the guitar and clasped her hands behind her back. The ghost of her final note thrummed softly in her ears. 15 sweating Methodists stood like statues in a sun shower. Jessica couldn't tell if they were breathing. She paused for a 4 count, fascinated by the power of her music. Her stomach fluttered. She blasted out a palm-muted pentatonic scale, and the statues came to life again. She moved the scale up the frets and ended it on the 24th fret, taking the last note to a little higher by pulling on the tremolo arm. Overhead, the fluorescent lights exploded and rained glass dust and white sparks. The sparks bounced off the floor and the pews. They grew and gathered around the 15 jigging congregates. A waist-height ring of fire that moved with the troop like ice particles around Saturn. Jessica played on and they flailed their way down the centre aisle, telling herself they were fine. The terrified Methodists outside the ring shied away from them, practically hugging the walls of the old square building. Then as one, the 15 flopped to the floor. Beneath them, the ceramic tiles parted in a jagged crack. The crack widened to become a chasm and ate up the dancers. Their brilliant white lights remained. It spread to the corners of the building. Indoor sheet lightning. Jessica gave in to the power of white brilliance. She could feel her blonde hair plastered to her sweat-drenched face. She tried to shake free and enjoy the sensation. Head-banging. All around her, white light and chaos mixed with the stench of human fear and escaped electricity. And she was head-banging. 15 fellow Methodists, free-falling to hell, and she didn't have to believe it. Her music liberated her from the guilt. A distant drumbeat faded into her six-string masterpiece, and the brilliant light funneled down into the chasm like a luminescent whirlpool. Tinny screams of satisfaction echoed from the void, joining the rising beat. Reverend Steele sank to his knees in front of Jessica like an over-enthusiastic Catholic and begged her to stop. She closed her eyes and played on, sweat dripping from her face, out of sight, out of mind. Jessica felt safe within the eye of the heavy metal tornado. More than safe. She belonged. She formed an open E power chord and thumped the top three strings. It saturated the church. She stilled her right hand and enjoyed the guitar's supernatural sustain. As the volume ebbed, she could hear the jabbered pleas from her father. Her heart went out to him, but the music was so good. She opened her eyes, intending to apologise to the minister before hammering out the next riff. But the gravitational pull of Satan's huge fire-engine red head emerging from the chasm dragged her eyeballs away from her father's tear-streaked face. The Reverend looked over his shoulder, then flumped it onto his side in a dead faint. The devil's black eyes met hers, and he smiled, revealing serrated teeth and a forked tongue. He whipped it across his scaly lips, dampening his black goatee. "Jessica Steele!" The voice bypassed her ears and crashed into her brain like a tidal wave. Her legs buckled and she landed on her backside. "That's my guitar." Jessica tightened her grip on the guitar's neck. "It's mine!" The devil shook his mountainous head, his horns knocked plaster from the high ceiling. "You know it's not your guitar. Look what it's done to this place. Give it back to me and buy yourself a safer one. Go wild and get a custom designer to imitate mine, but give me back that flying V. No." "I made a deal for it." Satan snorted and a plume of black smoke rolled from his nostrils. He puffed air through his lips and parted the black clouds. The smell of barbecued meat wafted towards Jessica. She clutched the guitar closer but didn't dare to attempt to get to her feet. "It's true. A guy with big feet and violet eyes sold me it. I traded my phone for it." "The culprit has been apprehended and demoted to door-to-door salesman. His verbal contracts are no longer worth the paper they're written on." "You can't do this." "I'm the goddamn devil, Jessica. I can do what I want." Jessica's vision blurred as her eyes floated in tears. How could he ask her to give it up? What would she do without it? Maybe... What do you want for it? "Good girl, Jessica. Now you're talking my language." The devil pursed his lips and hummed a blues scale. "It's got sentimental value. That's going to cost you your soul, I'm afraid." Jessica's heart sank. Her soul? She looked down on her father. He still lay unconscious at her feet. It was reasonable to assume he wouldn't be happy with her when he woke up. She looked around his beloved church. A soul's a big price to pay. I'd want more than the guitar for that. The devil narrowed his big black eyes. "What?" "Put this place back to normal and wipe everyone's memory, but mine. Can you do that?" "Easy peasy. I'll even throw in some plectrums." He disgorged a mouthful of clear glass ovals. To Jessica they looked suspiciously like the lenses from those little spectacles favoured by accountants and lawyers. She said, "Do we have a deal then?" "Absolutely." The devil spat a contract and a huge fountain pen at her. She gave it a once-over and lifted the pen in two hands. She paused, nib poised over the dotted line. "Wait a minute," she said. "What kind of music am I going to be able to play without a soul?" The devil chuckled, sending thudding vibrations through the room. He flicked his forked tongue across his lips again. "Where do you think manufactured pop music comes from, Jessica?" And that was Steele Guitar. A strange wee story, I'm sure you'd agree. But it was one of those ones where you just sort of let your imagination run wild. I wrote these back in like 2006 or 2007 or something like that. So I was still experimenting with my voice and with my subject material. I think they're the kind of stories I'd like to get back to writing at some point in my life, because there's something to be said for how much imagination they require and how much fun and escapism they can provide. I kind of like them, and Fireproof seems to be one of the more popular books that I've released. It has definitely got more Amazon reviews and whatnot than the other ones. It's closing in on 60 at the minute, which is pretty good, even though it doesn't sell crazily wild or anything, but I'm still quite happy with that. And I think I get more like emails and stuff from people who've read that book than from any of my normal straight crime fiction reads, so I think that's got to tell you something. So definitely before the end of this year I will have a follow-up to Fireproof written, and I'll send it to Endeavour Media and see if they're interested in publishing it, and if not, I'll just self-publish it, because I can do what I want. Ha! It's all my work. So and it's easy to self-publish stuff these days, really, but it would be nice to have a publisher behind it and pushing it out there. So we are closing on the half-hour mark, but the next story in this collection, titled 9 to 5, is a bit shorter than Steele Guitar. So I think we could probably bang this out before we hit the 40-minute mark, which is a fair enough length for a podcast, I would imagine. So we'll not waste too much time on any babbling. We'll maybe have another wee chat at the other side of this story, but let's do you a really good deal today, and you'll get 2 stories in one podcast. This one is titled 9 to 5 by Gerard Brennan. Nigel squinted at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Pillow lines road-mapped the side of his face. A weekend's worth of stubble gave off a bluish hue under the fluorescent light, and thick black curls corkscrewed on the left side of his head. On the right side they tangled into a sweaty clump. A team leader in the finance section of Alpha Office Supplies should lead by example and put some effort into his appearance. It said so in the staff handbook. "You're not looking 100% there, son. Not quite the alpha male." His reflection gawked back. So what? Then he noticed the deep, ragged gash on his right forearm. Green pus crusted the edges. Nigel was reaching for the ointment when he straight-armed the entire contents of the medicine cabinet into the sink. He bowed his head and blinked at the colourful assortment of smashed toiletries and medicines. He couldn't be arsed to put them back. A man could cut himself in all that broken glass. Instead he turned on the cold tap and held the wound under the icy flow. Then, without drying off, he wrapped a roll of surgical tape around his arm to hide the disgusting sight. He searched his bedroom for his office suit. The dull grey light, filtering through his crimped Venetian blinds, offered little help. Eventually he located the suit under his Argus computer desk. As he bent to scoop it up, a faintly musky scent filtered through his nostrils. He'd forgotten to shower. Rather than return to the bathroom, he sprayed a cloud of deodorant and dragged his body through it with a slow shuffle. After dressing, Nigel trudged downstairs and out the front door, bypassing the kitchen and his ritual cereal and coffee. His stomach grumbled. Nigel ignored it. He thumbed the button on his car key, and the red BMW 3 Series parked diagonally in front of the house across the street bleated and blinked its indicators in greeting. Nigel threw himself into the driver's seat. The suspension shifted and the tartan blanket in the back seat slipped to the floor, revealing its hidden bounty, the headless hooker from the night before. "Morning, love," Nigel said, gunning the engine. The hooker gave him the finger. On the Ormer Road, jammed in bumper-to-bumper traffic, Nigel considered the previous night's events. He'd felt sad, lonely, and more than a little horny. Hangover depression always gave him dirty thoughts. Instead of joining his housemates at the pub for the Sunday night quiz, he'd parked his BMW at the back of Belfast's BBC building and dandered up Linnenhall Street to score a prostitute. Before long, he found a decent enough looking girl with an emptiness in her eyes that screamed desensitisation. Deep inside, to match Nigel's self-inflicted depression. She grunted acceptance to his offer of 30 quid for a quickie in the back of his motor. The hooker followed him back to the car, too slowly for his liking. He didn't particularly want to be seen with a mini-skirted clad earring-wearing frizzy-haired mess. Also, her high-heeled stumbling lacked a certain grace. Then Nigel reminded himself of her price tag and thought no more about it. Sitting side by side in the back of the car, he struggled out of his trousers. She raised her arms to embrace him. "Wait there, love," he said. "No offence, but I'm not doing this without a rubber." He fished his wallet out of his inside pocket of his denim jacket. She moaned and edged closer. "Wait there," I said, "although I do appreciate the eagerness." Her mouth slowly opened and latched onto his forearm, bit through the tough material of his sleeve and into the soft flesh underneath. Nigel yelped and hit her with a left hook. The girl's head separated from her neck, hit the car window and splattered into chunky pieces. Nigel stared at the mess she'd made of his motor for several seconds before he realised her arms were still grappling with him. He scooted backwards, fumbled the car door open and flopped out onto the car park bitmac in a trouser-tangled heap. The air whooshed out of his lungs. As soon as he could muster breath, Nigel screamed until his voice cracked. Then he stood and pulled up his trousers. He considered abandoning the car. He couldn't bear to touch the headless hooker to drag her out of the back seat. But he was still paying the finance on the Beamer. It'd be a sin to let it go. Instead, he opened the boot and pulled out his red and green tartan picnic blanket. The decapitated whore still fidgeted. She ran her hands over the skull chunks on the back seat, searching for her head. He threw the blanket over her, and she settled down. When his heart calmed into a steady rhythm, Nigel clambered into the driver's seat and fired up the ignition. Sweating and mouth-breathing, he drove back to his house in South Belfast's Holy Lands. The arm wound began to itch. That night he drank a bottle of Hennessy in front of the television, but couldn't get drunk. He had everything he could get his hands on, but couldn't fill the hole in his stomach. He went to bed and couldn't sleep. By the time his alarm clock went off that morning, he felt numb. There was no other way to describe it. No worries, no problems, no complications, nothing. Nigel parked on the double yellow lines outside his office and yanked himself out of the car by grabbing hold of the no parking sign on the edge of the footpath. The receptionist gave him a funny look, but he didn't feel like talking. He grunted and lurched by. Nigel's manager, Liz Benedict, also non-ironically known as Thin Lizzie by Nigel and his team, called his name as he passed her desk. "Huh?" Nigel asked. "Did you fall out of bed?" Thin Lizzie tapped the face on her wristwatch with a long and bony finger. "Huh? You're very early." "Oh. That's a good thing." "Oh. I'm just a little shocked, you know, Monday morning and all." She forced a latte-scented chuckle, watching for Nigel's reaction over the top of her oval spectacles. He tilted his head. "You look a little rough, Nigel. Are you okay?" Nigel shrugged. Thin Lizzie straightened in her swivel chair and clasped her hands in front of her. "Anyway, I'm glad you're here. Could you email me Friday's sales figures as soon as? The big boys want an advance projection for month end." "Yes." Nigel went to his desk, logged into his computer and emailed the figures to his manager. "Nigel!" Thin Lizzie yelped his name in surprise. "Are these the figures?" Nigel swiveled in his seat and faced her. "Yes." "But you haven't had your coffee yet. I didn't think you even scratched yourself until the caffeine kicked in." "You said you needed them ASAP." "Yes, I did, but never mind, thank you." Nigel turned back to his keyboard and rattled through his data processing chores. His colleagues filtered in, some energetic, some barely alive. They talked about their weekends, did crosswords, walked among the cubicles with empty folders under their arms, sent jokes to each other via email, and anything else they could think of until actual work became unavoidable. While his team settled into their ruts, Nigel covered the phones, reconciled budgets, raised invoices and phoned overdue debtors. As his own in-trade diminished, he offered his services to anyone with a backlog. It appeared everyone in the finance section had a 2-week-old job hidden at the bottom of a paper pile which they were only too happy to pass on to their suddenly fastidious team leader. Nigel actioned each awkward problem without complaint. As was the Monday tradition, Thin Lizzie shared out the thin slivers of sponge cake amongst the staff during the morning coffee break. She baked something every weekend, insisting that a treat on Monday morning boosted morale. It was excuse enough for everyone to abandon their workload. Everyone, except Nigel. He rattled on his keyboard even as Thin Lizzie stood at his desk, cake tin in hand. "Don't you want any cake this morning?" she asked. "No thanks." "Why not?" Nigel stopped typing and looked up at her, pinched nose and pursed lips. She waited for his answer. "I don't know," he said. He rubbed his stomach and it rumbled, but he looked at the moist cake in the skeletal lady's hands, and he could muster no appetite for it. Maybe I am coming down with something. Please yourself. She sniffed the air and turned on her heel. He watched her leave, legs wobbling at the knees with giraffe-like grace. That girl really needs some meat in her bones, he thought. He went back to his duties. At lunchtime, the computer system went down, so going to the canteen for something to eat seemed the logical thing to do. He queued at the counter and bought what the girl in front of him had ordered. This eliminated the need to think about it. Some of his colleagues sat at his table and talked. Nigel didn't have very much to add to the conversation. It wasn't long before one of the guys noticed this and addressed Nigel directly. "Did you have a bit of a rough night last night, Nigel?" "Yes, Bob," he said, and went back to pushing cold past the bake around his plate. "Yeah, it looks like a lingering case of Monday morning hangover," Bob said. "You ought to get that looked at, my friend." Bob and the others had a bit of a snigger at Nigel's expense, and then tucked into their unappealing lunches. Nigel looked at Bob and licked his lips. He had never been very keen on the fat, middle-aged loser. He suffered the man's awful jokes and puns with a false smile, to offer as little encouragement as possible and to prevent a confrontation. Every company Nigel had worked for employed a wannabe comedian fat guy. Experience had taught him they were generally unhappy men with a quick temper, and not someone you wanted to be on the bad side of. But his colleague had a very interesting appeal today. His skin almost glowed, and his hanging jowls looked good enough to eat. "Maybe you and me should go to the pub after work, my friend," Bob said. "Get a little hair of that dog, I bet ye." "I'd like that." Bob no longer irritated Nigel. He focused on the fact that it was his turn to drink with the fat man again. The sweet, juicy, tender, fat man. Feelings stirred within him for the first time all day. Hunger, anticipation, an urgent want. "We should go somewhere that you can get a decent bite to eat, though," Bob said. "Lay in the old stomach before we do some hard drinking." "Yes, Bob," Nigel said. "A decent bite. That would be excellent." And that was 925. So we're actually halfway through that little collection of stories. And in the next podcast we'll maybe burn through the next 3 of them. Because I'm kind of enjoying revisiting the old work, and some of the lines as I read them there I was going like, oh, did I really read that? And there are surprisingly few instances of sentences that I'm sort of cringing at, which I'm really pleased about. I'm kind of one of those readers who can be highly self-critical, especially when I look over old work, so I have avoided reading a lot of my older books on purpose because of this. So it's nice to go back and not be too disappointed in my own creative self. Because there's not really much you can do about it once the thing's out in print, I mean, in these days of print on demand, you probably could update a few things and send it out, and it sort of limits those cringeworthy sentences. But at the same time, you sort of have to have an end point with your work. You can't always constantly adjust it, otherwise you're never going to create something new. Speaking of which, I'm having a bit of difficulty with that. As I mentioned earlier, I am going to start writing again soon, but I had planned to get a good go at writing on Monday. I think the heat has been holding me back a little bit because I'm kind of dragging my heels towards the concluding paragraph of my chapter on Steve Kavanagh's books, and that's not like me. When I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, I tend to speed up rather than slow down. And I love to clear a project off my desk, and this one has been hanging over me so long. I've actually missed the deadline, and I must apologise to Beth Mannion for this. I know Beth has listened to the podcast before, so she might hear this, but I'm so sorry I've missed this deadline. It's really not like me. It's probably the first deadline I've missed in about 10 years, and I plan to make that up to you by writing a really good essay. And maybe that's what's holding me back a wee bit on finishing this one, because I have had the time to do it and I've had the inclination, but maybe my confidence is rocked a wee bit by the fact that I haven't completed something in a wee while. Or at the very least, the last 2 things I've completed are still laying in my agent's in-tray, so to speak. I have 2 novels in the chamber, 2 police procedural novels set in Belfast and Warrenpoint. And they feature a new character of mine called Shannon McNulty, who's a detective with the Police Service of Northern Ireland, or the PSNI. And they haven't sold yet, so I mean, I think there's a part of me going, why the hell is this book not sold? I've read stuff that's way crappier than this, and it's got a really decent publishing deal, so surely mine should be out there. But there is a bit of a luck of the draw thing going on as well. Plus, I think Northern Ireland can be a bit of a hard sell at times to the UK publishers. So if you are thinking about writing and you come from my neck of the woods, you might want to consider that. Steve Kavanagh's books are all set in America, and like Adrian McKenty's books, although they're set in Northern Ireland and they've won so many awards and everything, he's still fighting tooth and claw to get a deal to finish off the Sean Duffy series, which I think is just pure insanity. When you read those books, they are so good, so good, and the awards that they've picked up, attests to that fact. And yet he still has to find a new publisher to finish off the series, which is just bloody madness if you ask me. Same with Stuart Neville. I mean, his last book, he's set in America with the pseudonym Halen Beck. I'm not giving away any secrets here, it's an open pseudonym. So to me it seems as if maybe there is a problem with shifting Northern Irish crime fiction. The people here don't seem that interested in it, and so the people in the UK aren't really either. So I may have to change direction myself. And I have an idea that would only work in an American setting, actually, because I need somewhere that's geographically bigger for it to, for the plot to make more sense. But like I said, I haven't really got started on it yet. So I am going to make myself finish this essay and get on to the next creative endeavour. Because I'm happier when I write. I'm sort of more centred and calm, and it feels good to create and to have written something. And although in interviews I've joked, and I think it was like the Dorothy Parker quote to say that I enjoy having written rather than writing, I might have misquoted her there or attributed it to the wrong writer, but I'm sure somebody will correct me. Either way, I used to say that, I enjoy having written. But really there's a lot to be said for catching that flow state in writing as well, when you're actually in it up to your neck and it doesn't feel like a struggle, like you've pushed your boulder all the way uphill for the day and now it's free rolling down the other side of the mountain. And there's a great joy to be had in that. In a day when you've written 3,000 words and you're completely exhausted mentally and all you can manage to do at the end of that day is watch some shit sitcom on Netflix, that's a good day of work, and that's something that really sort of lifts you mentally, even if it does exhaust you a little bit too. So I want to get that feeling back, I want to chase that like a junkie, trying to get that first high, and that's what I'm determined to do. So, dear listener, I make a promise to you today, because verbal contracts can sometimes be good for you and can, really force you to apply yourself. So, I promise by the next podcast I'll have written at least the first chapter of this new novel, and I might even read the first paragraph or two. Although I do think that I should probably read something from Disorder at some point. There's a chapter available in the Bangor Library event that's that was released as a podcast a couple of weeks ago, but the sound quality is not fantastic and it may not be that easy to listen to, so I'll have to pick out a nice chapter that has a good sort of self-completeness to it. That's what I liked about the chapter I did at Bangor Library. There's kind of like a self-containing feel to that story, which makes it a good chapter of choice. But I'm sure there's a couple more of those in the book, so I'll seek one of them out and get that read and hopefully get some more practice in before I do that. But yeah, there's a few interesting weeks coming up now as well. Hopefully I'll have shaken off whatever it is that's making me kind of flat and feel unhealthy, because I'm going to Harrogate this year. I think that's like the 19th of July. And I'm getting to take part in an event, a panel event that is focused on Steve Kavanagh's book 13, which is good timing considering I've been rereading all his work. And I have a really good idea of what's going on in his books and everything. Also, I'm quite friendly with Steve, so I sort of know what his plans are for the future and stuff. And he very kindly asked me to join the panel on this, which is kind of a big thing. Some random wee writer from Northern Ireland getting to go on one of the panels in the biggest crime fiction festivals of the year. So I really appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to getting over there and mixing with a few writers so that we can all bitch and moan about the industry and things like that. Something I was going to talk about when I was saying that there's not much of an appetite for Northern Irish crime fiction. I forgot to actually finish that thought off. But it'll probably come up when I am talking to people in Harrogate, because I guess I'll probably get chatting to some publishers and stuff and see what kind of things that they're interested in. But I do remember getting some feedback from my agent after one of her submissions. She said that one of the publishers had rejected me because I'm Irish and they already have an Irish writer on their books and they would like to focus on them. I thought, that smells like a whole big pile of bullshit, really. I mean, I wonder how many writers they have from London, and yet you can't have more than one Irish writer. I'm sure my work was quite different from theirs, because I make all due effort to make my voice stand out among the current crop of Northern Irish crime fiction writers. In fact, all writers from the whole island of Ireland, but that didn't seem to matter. Sort of lumped into our own wee subcategory, which I thought was kind of fucking shitty, So, fuck those guys. I wouldn't want them anyway. But yeah, it was a funny thing, to sort of be barred access right away before. Well, I mean, I imagine they might have read some of the book. Maybe it was just a polite way of saying that they didn't like the book without sort of committing themselves or hurting my feelings. But to be honest, it was more annoying to think that I would have been barred from an opportunity like that simply because I come from here, But sure. That wasn't the only weird one. The other one that I got one time was that I'm writing a female character's POV, which is fun and a challenge and something that I thought would be interesting for other readers, But they had concerns about me doing interviews as a writer of a novel set in a female's point of view, and they were like, I'm not sure I'll be able to get interviews in women's magazines and things like that. And I was like, what the fuck? That's kind of crazy. But, there you go. Apparently I should just be writing from a single white male's perspective. But I'm not going to do that, because fuck those guys. The book is good and the perspective is good, and I've had my wife read both books and she has no problem with how I've portrayed the main character, and she would definitely tell me if she did think I was doing a bad job. My agent is also a woman, and she had no problem with me writing from that point of view either. So again, I'm wondering, is that just one of those shitty excuses they come up with because they haven't quite fallen in love with the book and they can't really think of anything else to pick on? But I'm hoping this is interesting to people. It's not just me trying to complain and bitch and moan about my lot, because I'm actually quite appreciative of everything that I've got published so far, and I feel like I've been very lucky, having landed a PhD and been offered funding for 3 years and getting that publishing deal with No Alibis Press, which is friggin' fantastic. That Disorder is doing pretty well at the minute, and I'm really happy with the job David Torrance did with it, and I wouldn't change that for the world. So I'm not trying to be ungrateful and to bitch and moan and be completely negative in this podcast. What I'm offering instead is sort of an insight into the publishing industry and how fickle some of these commissioning editors can be, and how things can seem really unfair and you don't really understand exactly why you've been rejected or whatever. But at the same time, you have to sort of stop and think, so what? If you want to take like a Buddhist approach to this, all you can really do is accept the fact that you can't change what has happened, but you can control how you react to what has happened. So, in my mind, I'm sort of just going to acknowledge that these things irritated me at a certain point, but right now, I haven't really thought about them for a while, I sort of just entered back into that slightly negative train of thought because I was describing my difficulties in getting some work set in Northern Ireland published. But really, it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. I've gotten a lot of value out of writing those books. The sense of accomplishment in finishing each chapter, the mega sense of accomplishment in finishing an entire book and then going back over it and reading through it and realising that it's not a big pile of steaming shite, that it is actually a piece of art that is worthwhile and that would entertain people should it ever get published. Now, whether or not it ever does get published doesn't matter, because my wife read them and she enjoyed them, and I'm really happy with that. My agent has read them and she's enjoyed them, and I'm happy with that as well. And if they go no further, big deal. I'm not starving. My kids aren't starving. I'm not homeless. My life is pretty damn good. It's pretty cushy. And there's just this one thing that I want to do, and that is write books. But I'm not going to stop writing books just because these two haven't been picked up by a publisher. In fact, I'm going to dust myself off and try even harder with the next one. And the next one is going to be a fantastic book. Just you wait and see. Mark my words. And it's going to be the kind of book the publishers are going to be begging me to publish. That's what I have to believe if I'm going to finish this, because if I think that I am just writing something that is going to be ignored, even though it will give me that sense of accomplishment and it will entertain my wife and more than likely entertain my agent unless I really mess it up, I still have to believe that there's going to be something beyond that. You know, I want my work to reach as many readers as it possibly can, which is a good chunk of the reasoning behind doing this podcast. The little collection of stories, Possession, Obsession and a Diesel Compression Engine, for instance, hasn't sold a whole big pile. I'd say it's only been a couple of hundred sales, throughout its whole lifetime on Amazon. So I'm sort of reaching a few more people with these stories through the podcast. And that's good, that's a positive way to do it. And it's also getting to people who don't, normally read a book themselves, Some people are more happy to be told a story. And as someone said to me a few weeks ago, it gives it an extra dimension when they hear the way I read it. They hear it in my accent, they hear the words that I choose to emphasise. I realise I'm repeating myself here, but that was kind of cool too. That the performance is actually part of the art as well as the actual text itself. And that has me thinking a little bit of stage plays as well. You may be aware that I've written a few plays, one a collaboration with my dad called The Sweetie Bottle, which did really well a few years ago. And then I wrote a play called Your Turn on my own, which had 4 outings. Unfortunately, it looks like there might not be any more because the actress is going to Canada for a year. So it will be on hiatus for the foreseeable. But it still got out there. It still entertained over 100 people in its short run. And it was a lot of fun to see it brought to life on stage when I got to see it the 2 times that I did. And there's something about that instant feedback on, of a stage play that you don't really get with a book. You can read your Amazon reviews and all, but you can't, personally witness how people react to your words, to the performance of the play. Whereas when you're sitting in the audience of a play, you can see that right away. You can see what works and what doesn't work, which is a magical kind of moment. So, I might even toy with the idea of doing one of these podcasts live or something to try and find that feeling again. Or, and this is a big ambitious sort of if, I might write a one-man show in which I am the star, because I have no plans to go to Canada for a year. So, I can rely on me to actually be about to perform the play, and I can control everything, and that would be interesting. Be a different perspective on it. Be nerve-wracking, be tough, be ambitious, but it could be fun, And I'm sort of getting more at ease with performing, I suppose, by talking to myself into a microphone every couple of days. So hopefully that experience will pay off as well. So, anyway, I realise we're at the 53-minute mark of this recording, and my family is probably going to be home at any time now, so I should probably wrap this up. I'll try not to do the whole 700 goodbyes that is traditional in an Irish conversation, especially since there's nobody else on the other end saying goodbye to me right now in this live moment. So instead, I'm going to pick up my guitar and strike that glorious G chord that makes up the theme music of this podcast. Thank you for listening to the Gerard Brennan Disorder Podcast. Yous are all lovely, so yous are. Keep her lit, and I'll be chatting to yous again soon.